Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. We've been talking a lot about Marxism lately, but I want to take a good amount of time here and talk about Karl Marx himself. I think it's important to do this because Marxism, his ideology, will make more sense when you know about him, and also the type of person that his philosophy and ideology appeals to will make a lot of sense. And I think this history is just good to file away in the back of your brain for later, because we are in the full throes of a attempted Marxist revolution here in America. So who is Karl Marx? First, when you think of Karl Marx as a person, what do you think of? I'll admit, I've never thought of anything. I've never given him a second of thought. We've all seen his picture. Do you throw this picture up here? It's like the one picture I've ever seen of him here. So it's like a cracked out Santa. But if you asked me last year who Karl Marx was, I'd be like, oh, like a Russian politician or something. Like, I don't really know. I'd say Russian because he's like Stalin, Lenin, Marx, right? I would have put them all in the same category, but all that's wrong. He was born in Germany, was really radicalized in Paris, and then lived the rest of his life in England. And far from being a politician or anything, he never had a job. So he wasn't any profession. But I've never thought of him before. But again, I think it's important to know who he is because his ideology led to the deaths of millions and millions and millions of people. His ideology has spawned bad fruit. So who was he? All right, here's the very short, and then we'll go into more detail. His family disowned him. He had plenty of money continually coming in from many different places, but was always broke and always living in like starvation level poverty. He was ungrateful, a narcissist, egomaniac, zero sympathy for other people to the point of being cruel. He had no friends. He was never invited to any academic anything. He was virtually unknown in his entire lifetime. Spoiled beyond belief, and because he was always in debt, he had creditors hounding him, and he hated them. He hated the creditors, and therefore hated any system where he had to pay people back. His dad died relatively early in his life. He loved his dad, adored his dad, but he hated his mom, and major bitterness to his mom, said some horrible things, which we'll get to in a second. Engels, they're like the two peas in the pod, Engels and Marx. You couldn't even tell the two apart writing-wise. They were the same. You could almost think of all their writing is the same. Engels, he hated his dad. His dad owned a few different factories in different countries. Engels was a manager at one of them, which entirely bankrolled all of Marx's writings, which were, of course, intended to tear down capitalism, right? So you heard that right. So Marx's writings about tearing down capitalism was sponsored by capitalism. But that hypocrisy shouldn't be surprising. It's true among his followers today as well, right? Like, I'm going to write about how terrible capitalism is on my Apple laptop at Starbucks, right? All right, so there's the broad overview. Let's do some details here. So Karl Marx, born in Germany, 1818, into a 3-story townhouse. His parents were prominent citizens in the town. Came from a family of rabbis, but he just denounced Judaism, said some pretty bad things about the Jews for the rest of his life. But his family was very prominent. They had servants. We'll get to that a little later. Marx was the third born, second to survive, oldest boy, 6 younger brothers and sisters. Dad was a lawyer, owned a vineyard. I don't know if that was more just like a hobby or a business, but he owned a bunch of homes and he rented those out for more income. His son, Karl, idolized him, but again, hated his mom. He showed zero sorrow when she died, when he was older. Thomas Sowell said he grew up a brilliant, and that's true, but a brilliant, spoiled child who bullied his younger sisters and taunted his schoolmates. He went to his first university. He was a big drinker, rowdy. He got challenged to a duel, but refused to fight it. Went to another school, University of Berlin, where he just continued to spend all of his parents' money. Sowell called him a self-indulgent, or he had self-indulgent bohemian spendthrift habits that continued on for the rest of his life. He was sued several times for not paying back on his debts. His dad would write him letter after letter telling him to stop wasting money and stop being an egomaniac. And you could see the poetry that he wrote during this time of his life. He thought he was God. Thomas Sowell called it a demonic personality. And I want to be clear about Thomas Sowell's book, Marxism. The Claremont Review of Books says that Thomas Sowell's Thomas Sowell used to be a Marxist. Thomas Sowell's book on Marxism was too nice. Right? That's the critique, that he was too charitable towards Karl Marx. So when Thomas Sowell says he had a demonic personality, he took 2 college courses in 3 years at the University of Berlin. So again, he was a bohemian student who regarded college as his camping ground. And then he went on and got a doctorate at essentially a diploma mill. Graduated, started to run a newspaper, and it was awful. And he treated everyone horribly. They called it the dictatorship of Marx. He was domineering and full of boundless self-confidence, one of his colleagues then said. Early 1840s, his dad died. The estate didn't have enough to pay for 8 people. And he had a ton of bills that he couldn't pay, obviously, which was always the case. And his mom cut him off from an allowance here. And Marx said about his parents, he wrote about his parents, although they are quite rich, my family has placed difficulty in my way, which has temporarily placed me in an embarrassing situation. That quote is so important because, listen, not getting money is his parents putting him in a difficult situation, right? His parents didn't take money from him, just not giving it to him. So you can see how entitled he was and how it's always somebody else's fault, no matter what. Good for him, he married a rich woman, or a woman from a rich family. His family didn't show up at all to the wedding. Only a few members of her family did. He started another newspaper. They went bankrupt after 1 issue. They're fighting against the editor again. He had no money again, but some family came to the rescue. And as Thomas Sowell said, he was rescued as he would be again and again throughout his entire life. Moved to Paris. That's where he began to meet with all these other radicals, and this was the beginning of his communist ideology. One radical who was in this group and had a falling out called them a crowd of godless, self-appointed gods. Again, that speaks to the power hungriness that Marxists today have as well. Even today, Marxists are a crowd of godless, self-appointed gods. I know what's best. I'll order society. Friedrich Engels was one of those self-appointed gods in that group. That's where they met in Paris, and this is when they became partners in crime. So Engels came from a rich family, again, owned factories around the world, hated his dad. He was sent away to learn the family business, and as was said, he was not overworked. And he would just drink beer and smoke cigars all afternoon during his lunch because he was the owner's son. So just more entitlement, right? This is where these 2 guys found out about the philosopher Hegel. And we'll talk about him another day, but they joined this group called the Young Hegelians. I just want to drive this point home again. So Engels supported Marx and Marx's writings. Karl Marx's writings against capitalism were funded by a capitalist business. Engels called his job forced labor. Isn't that amazing? Obviously, at that point, though, he had no idea what forced labor would come to mean in the communist countries that Marxism was adopted from. But in Engels' world, working a cushy job as the owner's son was, I'm so oppressed. It's forced labor. That's how entitled and narcissistic these guys were. But without that payment coming in from Engels, Marx would have died of starvation. He almost did as it was. But it was entirely his fault. Karl Marx was never self-supporting, ever, never. He entirely survived on allowances and gifts and inheritances from his family and his wife's family. Both families cut them off, like personally, because of their doctrines, what they believed, and also, as they called it, prolonged dependencies. So they all cut him off, like physically, but still were giving him money. 1849, his mom gave him an advance on his future inheritance, enough money to live comfortably for years, and it lasted 1 year, gone. All of it was gone. Marx lived in the slums of London, could barely afford rent, groceries, bills. 3 of his kids died living amongst this squalor that he didn't have to be living in. Even though the allowances from Engels, the money that Engels was giving him, was enough for a lower middle class lifestyle. But he just spent it all and wasted it and lived in poverty. He got, I don't say he didn't earn anything. He got money from Engels that was 3 times the income of an unskilled worker. 3 times. Do you see the poetry here? He was given 3 times the wages of an unskilled laborer. Free money for doing nothing and wasted it all. More specifically, 1864, he got an inheritance that was 10 times what he lived on annually, and he was back in debt in 4 years. Still today, how good are communists at spending other people's money and going broke no matter what? When he overtook what would become the Communist League, someone inside of it called it the youthful offspring, or the people like Marx and others, the youthful offspring of privilege who called themselves the working man. What kind of privilege? Throughout all this, Marx had a maid. He had a maid from his family that his family paid for. She became pregnant. They blamed Engels. Engels was this big womanizer while in Paris. Engels took the blame to save Marx's family, but it was actually Karl Marx's, I think, son, and Engels admitted it on his deathbed. And Marx never had a relationship with his son. He was so poor at one point, he wrote that he may have to get rid of the maids. That was his quote, get rid of the maids. He was exploitative. He was callous. One of his babies died, and he wrote to Engels about it. And he was so self-centered that his best friend, his only friend, wrote back, "Sure, but you don't say how she is," meaning Karl Marx's wife. He wanted his inheritance as quickly as possible, and every inheritance. So every death in his family was only seen in economic terms. 1852, he wrote about the good news that his wife's indestructible uncle was sick. And he said, if that dog dies now, I'll be out of trouble financially. If that dog dies now, I'll be out of trouble financially. But it wasn't true. He never was. He was two-faced. There was a family member who wrote this book. And in a letter to him, he talked about how wonderful it was. And then to Engels, he talked about how horrible it was. He called him the N-word, this family member, and said some really awful, horrible racist things behind his back. So he was a two-faced liar. No academic contemporaries ever heard of him. That's another thing. Like, I just had this impression that Karl Marx was like this well-known, super popular, charismatic guy or whatever. No one ever heard of him. It wasn't even like, wow, look at this crackpot Karl Marx. He was total obscurity. John Stuart Mill lived for 20 years in the exact same city. They wrote about like the same things. Didn't even know Karl Marx existed. So I wonder how much insecurity came out of that as well. Karl Marx had this strategy of every organization that he joined, rule or ruin. So the goal was to either take it over from within, like come within under false pretenses and take it over, like be in charge of it, or completely destroy it. Same thing that the communists are doing today with Gramsci's long march through the institutions. Rule or ruin. Let me take a break here. I want to come back and I just want to share a couple quotes to wrap up this history of quotes from fellow revolutionaries of the time. And I want to be clear, these aren't people who were against Karl Marx, who have like an axe to grind or whatever, because there was no one against Karl Marx, because there was no, right? He don't even knew him, so there was no one really against him. So these are fellow revolutionaries talking about what a terrible, awful person he is. And then we'll bring it back around to today. And I'll give you a fallout of all this from today. It's going on right now, because it's all relevant. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, we're just talking about what a stand-up guy Karl Marx was in his life. Hope the sarcasm there was clear. Got some quotes here from fellow revolutionaries. Again, these were not critics of his per se or enemies, because he wasn't known. So these are just some of his few followers who spoke about him. If his heart matched his intellect, and if his heart had as much love as hate, I would have walked through fire with him. But a most dangerous personal damnation has eaten away all the good in him. Someone else wrote, for God's sake, after we've abolished all the dogmatisms, let us not of all things attempt in our turn to install another kind of dogma into the people. So he's talking to Karl Marx. He's like, listen, man, you're just as bad as what you're trying to replace. And don't we see the same thing today, right? So we have people saying, oh, we live in a white supremacist nation, so let's just have a different type of supremacy instead now, right? The oppressed are rising up against the oppressors to just instill their own type of oppression. And this, even one of Karl Marx's like fellow Hegelians back in Paris and England was like, whoa, man, like you're just as bad as what you're trying to tear down. Let us have decent and sincere polemics. Polemics is like discussion. He talked about tolerance and how we need more tolerance. Let us not make ourselves the leaders of the new intolerance. Let us not pose as the apostle of a new religion, even if it's the religion of logic and the religion of reason. Someone else wrote, I've never seen a man whose bearing was so provoking and intolerable to no opinion that was different from his. Did he give an honor of even a condescending consideration? Everyone who contradicted him, he treated with abject contempt. Every opinion he did not like, he answered with either biting scorn at the unfathomable ignorance that had prompted it, or aspersions on the motives of him who had advanced it. Is that not the exact same we see going on today? How dare you even ask how you're racist? Right? Oh, and any question you do ask is, aspersion on your motives. Like, oh, that's just because you, right? Exact same thing going on today. The Marxist movement we see today is a direct fruit from Karl Marx, the man. He glared at anyone who challenged his opinions, and he would say, I will annihilate you. So it's like a real life interaction from one person to another. Could you imagine if your boss or coworker or whatever said, I will annihilate you? What kind of psycho is this? He even almost lost Engels, his best friend. Engels' wife died. And Marx wrote him this nasty letter about his wife. And Engels wrote back, he's like, listen, man, even my casual friends, like acquaintances of mine, wrote me and said some wonderful things about me and my wife. And instead you took the chance to, you took the chance to show the superiority of your cool manner of thinking. So be it. In other words, like you took the opportunity just to be a jerk. There's claims that, oh, Slater, like you're just thinking about like the old Marx, later Marx, when he was more grumpy. But the early Marx was a nice stand-up guy. No, it was the same. Engels' first draft of the Communist Manifesto, and they both wrote it together, of course, Engels and Marx, but called for compulsory labor, ending dependence of wife upon husband and children upon parents. We're going to do a segment probably tomorrow about the woke cult's attack on children and attacking specifically the innocence of childhood. And it's a very concerted and specific effort to do that because everything's oppressed for suppressors. Remember, everything is oppressed for suppressors, which I'll prove in a second here. And one of those oppressor relationships is parent-child. The parents are the oppressors, the children are the oppressed. So they need to upend that relationship completely. And they're doing it in our education system very, very clearly. And part of that is destroying the innocence of childhood, drag queen story hours, stuff like that. So we'll prove that a little later. But that was early in the Communist Manifesto, is upending all relationships, wife, husband, even child and parents. They wrote about the creation of common dwellings to replace family homes. And we see Black Lives Matter, which our special is going to be about this Friday, with a very similar concept. Like, oh, the nuclear family is a white supremacist idea. Instead, we need a neighborhood, a community, a blah, 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 right? That's all Marxist stuff. And Marx said, when our turn comes, we shall not disguise our terrorism. It seems to me that everything the super woke left Marxists today fit in line perfectly with who Marx was as a person. When you think of the woke left today, who do you think of? Like describe that person. It was Marx. Entitled, narcissistic, egomaniac, looking for excuses to blame others for their own misfortunes, which seem to follow them everywhere. When you don't give them money, or when the government doesn't give them money, that's a tool of oppression, right? Wasteful with money, impossible to work with, impossible to get along with, callous, lacking complete empathy for others to a point of cruelty. Marx couldn't finish anything. Engels put Das Kapital together decades after Marx died. It took him like 16 years or something to put together the second and the third volume of Das Kapital. And it wasn't just because it was like some great, brilliant work that took a lot of time. It's because Marx never finished anything, ever. And it wasn't just he was a procrastinator. We're all procrastinators. This was way more pathological than just being a slight procrastinator. What else? Everyone hated him. He was insecure because he was so obscure, died in obscurity. It was decades later until his ideas got attention. Imagine if Engels wasn't such a sycophant himself and never published the writings of Karl Marx after Marx died. Imagine about that. Imagine how different history would be if Marx died in obscurity and his documents, his manuscripts never got published, and that was it, and there was no Karl Marx. Imagine how history would have been so much different. Let me just quote here. We'll wrap up with a quote from the Communist Manifesto itself. They said, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Now today, we've taken out class and we've added every other, like race struggle, gender struggle, it's just all struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, parent, child, even. They stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, so the revolution won, like the communist revolution or Soviet Union, or what am I thinking of? Cultural revolution in China, which we're going to talk about on Friday as well during our special, or in the Soviet Union. So either it worked, or in the common ruin of the contending classes, meaning the oppressors continued to win. But that the point is, everything is oppression always. And there it is right there in his writing. And then he said, let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians, the working men, have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. So he's just preaching a bitter hopelessness. Working men of all countries unite. Today it would be oppressed of all of America, let's unite. What a sad way to view the world. But of course it was picked up and here we are. Bitter, angry losers find great appeal in blaming others for their problems. Karl Marx did, and a lot of people still do today. So there you go. That's Karl Marx. Now you know the rest of the story. I want to come back and I'll give you a specific example of this in action today. Next, true story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So we spent a good amount of time talking about Karl Marx. Hopefully that all makes sense, and the connection between him and today makes sense as well. So let's apply it. This is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter in Vancouver. This is a tweet she sent out the other day. Her account has since been made private. She said, I want to problematize. Okay, let me explain that word real quick. Get rid of the tweet. Let me explain problematize. So, progressive, woke, Marxist mindset is you do not look, how do I describe this? The assumption is not to ask, is something racist? But you assume it is, and the question is, how is it racist? Okay, so everything is racist. That's the important thing. Everything is racist, you gotta find out how, that's your job. When someone in the left, when someone in the woke cult problematizes it, that's them taking a thing that to everyone else in the world is not racist, but they explain to you how it really is. Okay, so they're problematizing it. They're making it a problem. So you look at a thing and you're like, oh, that's not a problem. And they say, let me problematize for you it. Let me problematize it for you. So here, she wants, what does she want to problematize? Here it is, the concepts of reliability and loyalty as desirable qualities in an employee. It's part of capitalist white supremacy to believe that people should love their job or do it with enthusiasm, or even do it consistently well if their needs are not met. Reliable is code for follows colonial notions of time, puts job above all else, is unhindered by factors like systemic racism, must work to a consistent high standard set by white, able-bodied, middle-class people with stoicism, and the customer is always right, okay? So reliability and loyalty have to go. What are we doing? Right? It'll never stop. It'll never stop. It'll never be enough. They'll never stop problematizing. And this is the real root of Marxism. And once you know Marx, as we talked about for the first half hour of the show, it all makes sense. Karl Marx himself was someone who was terrible with money, a terrible leader, oppressive, cruel, mean, always in debt, hated paying creditors, hated paying rent, relied on inheritance from his wealthy family and super wealthy wife's family, even rooting for people to die so he could get his money. He was a miserable person who never wanted to work and never did. So of course he's going to talk about how terrible creditors are and how evil it is to pay rent and all this stuff. Of course he's going to talk about the evils of class structure. He was in the middle or even upper class, but couldn't live life properly to be comfortable in it. So he was bitter to everyone around him. And instead of improving himself, he sought to tear down the entire system. It's the same mindset here. This woman here says, we're going to problematize the word reliable. Why? Because she doesn't want to be, right? She doesn't want to be reliable because it's hard work to be reliable. So I'm going to problematize it, make it racist, and then voila, I don't have to be anymore. She's going to problematize being loyal because she doesn't want to be. Now, she'll do the asterisks of as an employee, right? She doesn't want to be loyal to her employer. She doesn't want to go to work on time because that's a colonial notion of time. What is time anyway, really? It's just the white man's master's tool of oppressing me. Right? She doesn't want to be loyal because she's selfish and narcissistic. So she's problematizing these virtues. Let's make being reliable and loyal racist concepts so that I can continue to be unreliable and disloyal and selfish all the time, and then not only be those things, but make those things a virtue. Right? That's the Bible verse. It's Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, and who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. It's exactly what this is. Woe to the person who makes loyalty and reliability bad and unreliable and disloyal good. But that's exactly what she's doing. Reliable and loyalty is racist, and being unreliable and disloyal is now the new virtue, and she is just the high priestess of those. Marxism has a two-pronged approach. First, tear down and destroy everything that is good. You must do that. And then you must also lift up and celebrate everything that is bad. Because who are you to say that it was ever bad, right? The white colonial oppressors said it was bad for all of history, but we're going to prove that it's not actually bad, it's actually good. So they got to tear down all the good virtues. We're going to do a segment. We're going to do it today. We don't have time. So tomorrow we'll talk about justice and how there used to be a justice was one of the four cardinal virtues. So there's a very Christian definition of justice. The Christian view of justice is peace and harmony with others and empathy and love. But the goal of social justice is the opposite, revenge and destruction. So tear down what is good, even the concept of justice, and then lift up what is bad. Here's an example. This is AOC from this weekend.
So why is this uptick in crime happening? Well, let's think about it. Do we think this has to do with the fact that there's record unemployment in the United States right now? The fact that people are at a level of economic desperation that we have not seen since the Great Recession? Maybe this has to do with the fact that people aren't paying their rent and are scared to pay their rent. And so they go out and they need to feed their child and they don't have money. So you maybe have to, they're put in a position where they feel like they either need to shoplift some bread or go hungry that night. Maybe
bread.
The fact that
we stop there. We're just
have not been.
We stop there. We're just getting some bread, right? We just need bread. That's it. It's just bread. Dozens of shootings in Chicago every week, and it's just people wanting bread. 600 murders in 6 weeks in 6 cities. You've seen all the videos of looting and everything, people stealing TVs. They're just using that. They're going to sell the TVs and buy bread. That's all. Just people buying bread for their family. There's a great Simpsons clip of Fat Tony from the mob, and he wants Bart to work for him. And Bart says, "Are you guys crooks?" And Fat Tony says, "Hey, Bart, is it wrong to steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family?" And Bart's like, "No." "Well, suppose you have a large starving family. Is it wrong to steal a truckload of bread to feed them?" Bart's like, "Oh, I guess not." "Well, what if your family don't like bread and instead they like cigarettes? And what if instead of giving them cigarettes, you sold them at a price that was basically giving them away? Would that be a crime, Bart?" Have you seen, show this video here, guys. These are people pillaging an Amazon delivery truck. Now, the video, granted, is from far away, so I can't quite make out exactly what they're stealing, but I can only assume that they mistook it for a bread truck. That's all I can only imagine. There they are. The bread. Hey, guys, there's bread. Guys, check out all the bread. And look at that. There's. Now, see, it looks like a TV, but don't be mistaken. That's bread. I don't know why they've been doing this lately. Something with the pandemic and there's shortages of boxes, and they've been putting bread in TV boxes and stuff. It can be tricky. So they're all just stealing bread to feed their family. That's all that is. Don't think it's anything different than that. So you see how stealing has become a virtue? You're just feeding your family. Now you're providing for your family too. Going to work, being reliable, being loyal, and not committing crimes. But you're the problem. You're the racist. These people just stealing bread, murdering people in broad daylight, the uptick in crime, they're the real heroes. Why is this the case? Because the oppressed can do no wrong, ever. And the oppressors, you, can never do anything right. Loyalty, reliability, racist. Get used to it. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So all this stuff we're seeing now has been festering in our universities for many decades now. We went back to the Frankfurt School in the 30s, so you can say 90 years, geez. And there's people who have been working on fighting this for a long, long time. And I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, what are you guys doing? It's just on college campuses. It'll never leave. And what's the big deal?" And they saw it. Robert Shibley's here. He's the executive director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Mr. Shibley, how are you, sir?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Now, you guys have been yelling FIRE for a long time, and alas, here we are. Let's go back, sir. Your founders of FIRE wrote The Shadow University, The Betrayal of Liberty on America's Campuses, wrote it in 1999. What did these guys see going on 21 years ago that made them write this and led us to where we are today?
Well, they had seen the effects of sort of the first big wave of political correctness, which came around the 1990s, where it really started to become noticeable to people. Even in Congress, there were some hearings about it. And they had been concerned about the problem. One of our founders, Alan Kors, was now a retired professor at the University of Pennsylvania who teaches history. And the other, a civil liberties lawyer in Boston, Harvey Silverglate. And they had gone to college together and realized that the college experience now was not the same as the one they had had growing up. That sort of trademark freedom that everybody expected out of college was no longer in evidence. And so they wrote this book, The Shadow University, to talk about what universities basically were doing in the shadows, out of sight of people, and try to expose it. And when they did, they got such an enormous response from professors writing them and saying this is exactly what it's like, that it threatened to take over their lives. So they founded FIRE the next year to kind of handle what was the legacy of that book and how many people were coming to them and saying, help, I'm in this same situation. And unfortunately, while some of the problems that described in the Shadow University, like speech codes that were actually labeled speech code, like you could look it up and, in the, that was considered a sort of a progressive type of rule that colleges could put in place to make people more comfortable. Those are mostly gone. Now they're hidden. And we have other challenges. Obviously, nobody had really, there was cancel culture then, but not in the same way that it could hit you, several minutes after you put out an ill-fated tweet. It took a lot more effort to cancel somebody back then. A lot of it, I believe the book's still in print, and a lot of it really holds up, frankly, just as well today as it did 21 years ago.
Can you paint a picture of what universities used to be? It's been so long since they've been. So what do they used to be? And I'll give you a little devil's advocate to start off with. Like, a woke person today would say, "Oh, you mean the universities that only used to serve rich white men and would never right? So and would only read dead white oppressing colonial. That's the university you want to go back to, Robert?"
Yeah, well, you hear a lot of that sort of thing, but I think it's important to remember that you heard that same thing 20 years ago when I was in college, and I'm not sure when you were in college, but that same complaint has been going on for a very long time. And the fact is, graduating from college in the 1990s or early 2000s, there was, frankly, and I think many people will recognize this, greater freedom to talk about these issues, whether issues of race, issues of sexism. You could have these discussions with people who looked different from you without having the same, obviously, again, didn't really have the cancel culture stuff. You might alienate people sort of on an individual level, but there was, that personal, more of the sort of seeing, I think, one another as a person rather than just a representative of a group. And when I talk to students on campuses these days and tell them some of the things that we used to be able to talk about in college, they can't believe that anybody could do that. It seems it's a totally foreign experience to them, but that's the experience you were supposed to have in college. It's one of the reasons you paid so much, although now it's catastrophically more that you pay for college, was to be able to actually talk about issues and maybe even be wrong or change your mind on things. And it seems like there's really been an effort to totally eliminate that from the college campus. So was there ever a perfect time on college campuses? No, because we don't live in utopia, and there's never been a perfect time in America or any other country, but we definitely have been backsliding in recent years, and I think there's no way to deny that.
Give us an example of what's going on at Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado Boulder.
Well, this is a great example. So at CU Boulder, and in response to a students of one of the, frankly, hundreds of cases we've seen where students are in trouble for saying, politically incorrect, and I use that in sort of the literal term. They tripped over a rake that was put in front of them. It's kind of where they thought they had free speech, and it turns out they didn't. CU Boulder actually came out and publicly said that if you can't get on board with the values of this university, that you should probably not come here. What's really appalling about that is that there are certain values of a university that you should adhere to. The value of thinking education is important. The value of free speech and hearing other people out. But the values that Boulder was talking about here were really very heavily political and ideological values. And to see a public university supported by taxpayers saying, children of, or yourselves, taxpayers of Colorado, you are not welcome to come here. We're here from the government, and we're here to tell you you're a lousy person and we want nothing to do with you. Please give us your money and get lost. Is really, I worry that it's going to end up, symbolizing a turning point in the way that the people who run public universities feel free to, frankly, insult their constituents, go after their students, and ultimately, I think is going to undo public university education and maybe university education, writ large in the United States, because I can think of no earthly reason why you would support a university that thinks you're a loathsome human being because of your beliefs.
No, there's. I never thought I'd see the day when I would not want my kid to go to my alma mater. Right. That was like one of the reasons to go, was maybe it would help my kids go. And now there's no way I would drop them off there. There's not a chance. Listen to this. This is pretty wild. So is this the president, DeStefano? While as a public institution, we must acknowledge each person's First Amendment right to free speech. I love that it's like an aside. It's like legally, I have to mention this. We strongly encourage anyone who doesn't want to or believes they cannot live our values of respecting the rights of others and accepting our differences to reconsider their ability to be a productive member of our community. Now, the Marxist code there is respecting the rights of others and accepting our differences. It's the opposite of what they actually mean, right? Like, what are they really talking about there when they're talking about respecting our differences?
Yeah, well, I mean, a big part of the program is to totally redefine words so that you can make these statements and make them sound like they're reasonable when they're not. I mean, respecting the rights of others, one of the primary rights of others, if you ask people to make a list of what the rights of Americans are, for instance, a lot of them would start with number one, I have freedom of speech. Obviously, that's not the right they're talking about. So what is it that they're talking about in terms of rights of others? And what it really means is, that they've integrated the idea of respecting rights into agree with our political platform or else you're not going to be welcome here. And there's really no other way. I mean, obviously there's more to it than just respecting freedom of speech, in terms of respecting the rights of others, and there's moral and legal rights. But agreeing with someone's political platform cannot be a requirement to be considered respecting the rights of others. That's ludicrous.
Yeah. And you can't ever offend anyone ever, which is an impossible standard to ever meet, because
that's not true. It's actually significantly worse. You can't offend people who are under the political protection of the authorities. Whatever people those might be this week or this month, it's totally free to offend people. And frankly, it brings up the ugliest chapters of our history where it was fine to offend, treat other people wrongly, etc. Because of people's skin color or because of, whatever unchangeable aspect about themselves they have. And it was morally wrong then, and it's morally wrong now. And we shouldn't make any bones about that. It's wrong to treat people differently because of their skin color. And the way to stop doing that is to stop doing that.
And the mob will never be appeased. Today's Tuesday, so Monday, when the Washington Redskins announced that they're going to change their name, like an hour or two later, the Washington Post published an opinion piece about how the Texas Rangers need to change their name as well. So it'll never, ever be enough for the mob. Here's my last question for you, Robert. Princeton and their list of like 45 demands that last I checked, 350 faculty members signed, which is like bonkers. I first read this thing and before anyone signed it, I thought like 3 students would sign this or something, but almost all the faculty have signed it. It's crazy. So one of the things that's in this demands, among other ridiculous ones, is to constitute a committee composed entirely of faculty that would oversee the investigation and discipline of racist behaviors, incidents, research, and publications on the part of the faculty. That to me seems like the final purge of any conservative professor. If you can have a group of Marxist faculty members who are in charge of the investigation and the discipline of anything that anyone does that is racist, and as we know, everything is racist. What do you make of that demand?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the end of academic freedom. I mean, basically, it means that you're going to impanel a group of political commissars, however constituted. Obviously, since universities are overwhelmingly on the left, it's likely to be people on the left, but wouldn't really make it any better if it were people on the right. In terms of saying, I'm really interested to see what they think is coming out of Princeton in terms of racist research. For instance, what part? I mean, is this, there you can have racist research. The Tuskegee experiments would be an example of literally racist research where they infected black men with syphilis and then didn't treat them. That would definitely be racist research. I'm very dubious as to anything like that happening. I certainly hope it's not happening in Princeton in 2020. And I think you read it right in that what it really is saying, you know, we are going to look over all of your academic work and decide whether or not it's racist. And it's interesting, you know, FIRE and others objected to this. And the response by one of the people defending the demands is they said, well, you know, this isn't just going to be a committee where, you know, in a dark room where we sit around determining what's racist. But as far as I can tell, that's exactly what they're demanding.
Well, the next line, guidelines on what counts as racist behavior, incidents, and research and publication will be authored by a faculty committee. So they're the ones who decide to do that. Robert, appreciate you, man. You're doing very, very important work, you and everyone at FIRE. Real quick, in like 30 seconds, the people who say, oh, this, for years have been saying, oh, this is just on college campuses. Now it's clearly not. What do you say about that and how this is a breeding ground for what we see everywhere?
Well, it's impolite to say we told you so, but we did told you so. And you know, I mean, it's completely. It would be weird if we were teaching this stuff on campuses and it didn't come off of campus. That's the reason we send people to college, to learn things and learn how to behave. And so this is what they were taught. And so now that's what's happening. So, you know, we're all living on college campuses now, and people are getting a very ugly, you know, an ugly expose to themselves of what we've been paying for and frankly indebting ourselves for to the tune of billions upon billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars. I forget how much student debt is, but also just the personal level of it as well.
My alma mater is now $57,000 a year. That's
Mine probably is maybe even more than that, yeah.
Unbelievable. Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, FIRE, thefire.org. Robert, appreciate you, man. Keep it up.
Thanks for having me.
Is that the end of the show? We're done? We got to go? All right, we'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on K through 12 education and how all this social justice nonsense is purposefully being pumped into your child's brains. Just like there's no reason to spend $57,000 a year to send your kids to these schools, under no circumstance should you be sending your child to a public school, K through 12. And I'll prove that tomorrow. True story. I'm excited. Spread the word.